Final Fantasy VII is heralded as one of the greatest games ever made. This was the game that showed many of us just how intriguing stories in video games could be. It spawned the popularity of the Japanese RPG in the West and got companies to take risk localizing their games. The legacy it left behind is still being felt today in the gaming industry. In some ways, I feel no other game has been able to move the industry in such ways since. This is why so many people were excited when Square Enix unveiled the project back in 2015. It was a rush of nostalgia for many fans. Being able to see this game recreated with HD graphics was a dream come true for so many of us. Square Enix would not have it easy though. After all, how do you remake such an iconic game? Originally handled by CyberConnect, this game automatically garnered ire for being announced that it was going to be episodic. Most of the criticism subsided once it was revealed this would be a full-sized game. Each part would feel like a normal-sized Final Fantasy game. Perhaps what blew me and many others away was the immediate marketing and attention to detail Square Enix was putting into this game. Every trailer was carefully crafted to cater to the audience that grew up with this game. To play off of our nostalgia for this title, it worked, and Square Enix was able to keep hype alive. Many of us, though, perhaps thought Square Enix would rekindle their glory days and make a game that felt like it belonged on the PlayStation 1, but on modern consoles. Final Fantasy VII Remake is a hard game to review, because it seems its reception of the game is about as divisive as whether or not pineapple goes good with pizza. It seems that there are two sides most people lean down. Either you love it or you hate it. If I'm being honest, I find myself torn right down the middle. There are aspects of this game that I feel are handled extremely well, and other aspects I feel fall flat on its face. I've got a lot to talk about, so sit back, relax, subscribe to the channel, and let's review Final Fantasy VII. Let's begin on some positives. Perhaps what I enjoyed most about this game was the characters. Much like the original game, the characters are all amazing and stay true to themselves throughout the game. The voice actors they picked really help bring these characters to life in ways that we have never seen before. Brianna White as Aerith does an exceptionally well job at bringing her to life. She is able to capture her innocent personality well, but also brings her not-so-innocent side out. Perhaps what I enjoyed about Aerith most is how knowledgeable she was about the slums. Sure, she was in the original, but you really get to see this in the game. That was something as a whole the game did extremely well. The game gave you time to get to know each and every one of the characters, their motives, and what made them tick. It was these moments throughout the game that shined the strongest. Even minor characters such as Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie were able to get limelight. Jessie was another character that got time to really shine, allowing us to learn of her motives for joining Avalanche and a quest to go along with it. One thing I was nervous about how they were going to handle was Cloud's character. Cloud feels like his character should, and is not depressed, and feels like he's giving up hope on life like he has been in Kingdom Hearts and Advent Children, to just name a few. John Eric Bentley does an amazing job as Barrett. He gets that gruff, angry man we all know Barrett for down to a T, but also gets down the fatherly figure as his interactions with the Marlene are just priceless. It amazes me at how faithful this game is to the original, with lines of dialogue ripped right from the original. It was nice to see the scene "I'll cut them off" during dialogue during the Corneo scene. As a matter of fact, Wall Market as a whole was done extremely well. Square Enix definitely didn't shy away from anything, and they went all in. I'd argue the whole Honeybee Inn scene played out far better in the remake than it did in the original. Characters such as Madame M and Andre Rodeo were surprisingly entertaining. Even right down to the inclusion of the Coliseum feeling like it enhanced the scene, it really nailed that feel of what Wall Market was, a criminal-ran town where shady dealings happened all the time. The remake also nailed the look and feel of Midgar. It took it a step further to bring this town to life. One of the best additions came early on during the game's second chapter. As you make your way back to the train station, you're able to hear citizens talking, wondering if their loved ones are okay, and being glad that they didn't go to work today because of the reactor blowing up. It really cements the ramifications of blowing up the reactor and asks the question if Avalanche really is the good guys. Some of it was lost due to them showing that it was actually Shinra that blew it up and not Avalanche. But at the same time, it still feels like it's being an emotional impact and makes the characters in the game question, what they've done, if it's right. It was something really cool to see. Midgar is also brought to life by the hustle and bustle of the slums. You really get to feel as if you are exploring this area that is a run-down shithole to live in. Life in the slums is oftentimes explained as feeling like being imprisoned, because of how people can't leave easily and they can't see the sky because of the ugly plate above them. This is something you get to witness, and it really does give off this vibe of like, wow, that would suck to live in a place like this.
It's pretty old. Be careful.
Okay.
Easy now.
You worry too much. I'm not some princess who needs to be coddled. Shit. Whew. That was unexpected. Thank you, Cloud. There it is.
Another area the game excels in is its combat. Square Enix for the better half of a decade have been trying to find a blend between their ATB combat and action-based gameplay. It seems they have nailed it too. This doesn't feel like your typical hack-and-slash RPG. Each character is designed to have strengths and weaknesses the player must learn to use to gain the upper hand in battle. Cloud is your hard hitter. He is able to block and counter physical attacks by switching between Operation Mode and Punisher Mode. Punisher Mode has weaker attacks but is much faster, and Cloud also moves faster with this mode. Punisher Mode is crucial for enemies like shock troopers and infantry soldiers with shields. You can also parry by switching into Punisher Mode just at the right time. Barrett is more of a long-range attacker and essential for flying enemies. He is also able to charge up his ATB gauge fast by sending an onslaught of bullets hurling towards the enemy. This makes him very useful when you're in a pinch and need to heal, or when you need to hit an enemy with its elemental weakness. Aerith is able to deal damage with her basic attacks. She also has the strongest magic in the game. Tifa is great for quickly building up the stagger gauge through a flurry of attacks. It is for this reason I found it beneficial to keep the elemental materia on her at all times. Red 13 is just a guest character and cannot be controlled. Much like Final Fantasy XIII, staggering is pretty much essential to gaining the upper hand in combat. By exploiting the enemy weakness or sometimes attacking constantly, the enemy will enter a pressured state. This is your chance to keep applying pressure and make that push to stagger the enemy. Materia is also another standout feature, and much like the original game, it plays a crucial part. Materia serves the function of casting magic, summons, buffing your characters, and other abilities, such as using magic on multiple enemies. Something that actually irritated me about the combat was the boss phases, because a cutscene would trigger and your stagger gauge would reset, making you feel frustrated because of all the work you put in to build it up, only to have to start all over again. Final Fantasy VII also handles the summons extremely well. This is something that Final Fantasy has struggled with really since Final Fantasy XIII, of finding a good way to incorporate the summons, and they really nail it here. They feel like an extension to combat and not a tacked-on feature. Speaking of materia, let's talk about equipping it. Equipping materia is pretty much the same way it was in the original. You apply it to your weapon and your armor. Certain slots will be connected and others won't. Connected slots allow you to equip two materias together, such as Elemental or Magnify. Magnify being this game's version of all. Another feature welcomed was being able to upgrade your weapons, making all weapons relevant. This allows you to change up your playstyle. Each weapon is divided into a core and subcores. By gaining AP, You'll be able to level up your weapon and give it additional strength, magic attack, as well as various elemental buffs. You can upgrade your weapon as you see fit, as it doesn't restrict you to a set path. You will also be able to upgrade a weapon with additional materia slots. Each weapon has a unique ability specific to that weapon, and once each character's proficiency with that weapon is maxed out, those skills are forever learned. The weapon customization was a really nice touch. It was a feature that lent itself nicely to the game. I often found myself switching between weapons, especially in earlier parts of the game. My blade of choice at first was the iron blade. At this time, I didn't have any materia slots that were connected, forcing me to equip the Buster Sword and combine the elemental materia with lightning to deal damage to enemies that were giving me fits. Perhaps this is where the game's claim of it being too difficult comes from. Most recent Square Enix games haven't really been challenging, and most fights could be blown through with relative ease in Final Fantasy XV. Even its hardest difficulty, Final Fantasy XV posed no real challenge. Not with the remake though. This game is specifically built to teach you what you have done wrong and forces you to change your strategy to adapt. You'll see the game over screen on more than one occasion. Another thing I enjoyed about this game was items using an ATB gauge. This added urgency and some creative thinking on how to keep party members alive until your ATB gauge filled up. This halts you from abusing the rinse and repeat nature of just pausing the game and pulling up a menu and healing when you're low on health. Its combat can be punishing but never feels unfair, leaving you with a rewarding feeling when you take down that boss you've been struggling with. Another inclusion to the gameplay is the motorcycle combat. This pops up twice in the game's story. It's not by any stretch of the means bad, but it did feel kind of out of place, like it did in the original. There is entirely 2 boss fights you have to fight while on your motorcycle, and it looks cool and plays well enough, but never really hits the same strides as traditional combat. I did enjoy it though, and found the concepts well executed and fun to mess around with. This was also kinda a complaint I had with the game, as I was a bit disappointed with Roche, namely because the trailers built him up to be like he was going to play some major part in the game. Then it was like they forgot about him. His only purpose was to serve as a boss for this one scene alone, which was a shame because I found his character one of the more interesting aspects of the game. One of the major complaints about Final Fantasy XIII was how linear the game felt. While I do understand why they did it from a design decision, it came at the cost of boring the player. Linear game design isn't bad, but I think the game industry as a whole has taken the approach that it is over the past decade because of Final Fantasy XIII. It really became the poster child of what not to do when making a linear game. The remake addresses those issues though, by breaking up the monotony of the battles. This was the crux of the problem many people, myself included, had with Final Fantasy XIII's linear design. The game gives you time to explore your surroundings, but also gives you dialogue from your characters to listen to, giving them time to grow and flesh out their personalities. NPCs around town also get additional dialogue, expanding upon the lore and insight into what's going on in the world. The game offers enough puzzles to break up the dungeons, so it's not a constant run and fight. This was a welcome update over Final Fantasy XIII. This, however, is where we steer into my first major complaint about the game. The dungeons feel way too long. It feels as though the dungeons were intentionally padded out to make the game longer. There were a couple of late game dungeons that felt this way. One such instant had you going back down into the sewers to retrieve a certain item. I actually enjoyed the second boss fight with Abzu, but found traversing the sewer again very unnecessary. It's almost like the developers knew they were not going to have enough content in Midgar alone to make a full game, so they made the dungeons longer to make this game feel longer, and it's a shame, because the dungeon design was great. They just overstayed their welcome. Another major complaint I heard from many people were the side quests. For me personally, this was relatively minor. I thought the side quests fit fine and added additional rewards and hours to the game. If we are really going to criticize the remake side quests, then we really need to hold every other RPG released over the past decade to the same scrutiny. I will say they were handled much better than in Final Fantasy XV, and the rewards felt more rewarding than they did in 15. The graphics were absolutely mind-blowing. I'm still trying to process I've just played through Midgar with graphics that look this amazing. I've heard others complain about the picture quality and the pre-rendered backgrounds, but this wasn't a big deal to me. I've also heard others complain that sometimes the pixels loaded in slow. I noticed this sometimes, but it never really bugged me. Hiccups and loading textures isn't something that I'm actively looking for either. Still though, if this says something that bothers you, it is worth mentioning at the very least. The character models look absolutely stellar, especially the main cast and the supporting characters. The NPCs could have used some additional work, as it seems it was hit and miss for a lot of those characters. The creature and enemy designs was another thing I really enjoyed, particularly how well they looked and fought. They paid attention to details and found ways to incorporate their movesets from the original nicely. Midgar looks just like it should have, and iconic places such as the church looked beautiful. There were also some Easter eggs spread throughout the game for those familiar with the compilation and other material. Fans will be familiar with. I may do a video about these Easter eggs at some point in the future. The biggest point of contention for me was the ending, or really the last 2 chapters of the game. I don't know what to say other than I was disappointed with the direction that it veered off in. The direction of this game is a big slap in the face to those who grew up with the original. I've heard so many complaints from people. What did you expect, a shot-for-shot remake of the original? Yeah, I did. Square Enix marketed as that. They explained that they would be adding to the lore, not changing it to subvert expectations. I'm not even mad about the ending. If anything, I'm curious to see what direction this is going to go. I just hope certain iconic scenes from the original will stay intact, because there are specific parts I'm looking forward to seeing in the remake. The music in Final Fantasy VII is almost as iconic as the game itself. I'm often not a fan of music being remade, reorchestrated, or redone in any fashion in a game. When it comes to ports or remasters, I will almost always choose the original soundtrack over the redone one, because I choose to have a more authentic experience. However, with the game like Final Fantasy VII Remake, I can see why they decided to do this. Not only does the game feature music from the original game, but it also adds brand new tracks, which we will talk about in just a moment. The fact this game has original music shows why they made the choice to not give us the option to change it back to the original, and you know what? I'm okay with it. They have done a great job at recreating Uematsu's original compositions. Uematsu is a master of his craft and arguably the best game composer ever, and this soundtrack feels like a tribute to his work rather than trying to work against it or replace it. Some of the soundtracks which were done really nicely was Dawn of the Slums, Shinra's Creed, which was originally Mining Town in the original game, to the different renditions of the battle themes. Something which really took me by surprise was the inclusion of the original songs for the remake. Masashi Hamauzu has always been a great composer, and while he was discredited by many for his work on Final Fantasy XIII soundtrack because he wasn't Uematsu, I think reception over time for 13's soundtrack has vastly improved. Hamauzu's original work really shines in this remake. This feels like an extension to the game's original soundtrack. It also breathes in new life into some of the new areas you get to explore. One thing I will say for sure, the Final Fantasy VII Remake isn't a rekindling of Square Enix of old, but it's a good start. I couldn't help but feel if Square Enix applies this to Final Fantasy XVI, they might be able to have another Final Fantasy VII on their hands. They have some things to learn, some things to improve upon. Couple that with the original story, and Square Enix has got a formula for success. I also feel like if Square Enix takes some of the criticisms that they're getting from this game and adds upon it into the sequel, they might be able to make the sequel even better than this game was. Final Fantasy VII Remake isn't a bad game, but it did leave me desiring quite a bit. Final Fantasy VII Remake is a very divisive game for me. On one hand, the characters, combat, and some of the additional story elements really exceeded my expectations. The added difficulty of learning from your mistakes in combat added depth I've been missing from Square Enix games of late. On the other hand, the ending plays out like a poorly written fan fiction and has no place being in Final Fantasy VII. The dungeons overstay their welcome, and it feels like they knew going in Midgar was not sufficient enough in content to make a game solely based around it. I can't give this my Gaming with Spoon seal of approval, but as a standalone game, as much as this stayed true to the original for the most part, the combat, its characters, and story, it's a game Square Enix titles to come out this generation. And while it isn't the swan song Square Enix needed to send off the PlayStation 4, it's a step in the right direction. I'm very curious where Square Enix will take the Final Fantasy VII Remake and other entries in the Final Fantasy series in the future. Despite its shortcomings, Final Fantasy VII Remake was still a very enjoyable game. I don't want this to come off sounding like I absolutely hated the game, because I didn't, because its positives definitely outweigh its negatives, but as an experience that comes along and does the original justice, I just felt like it was lacking in a lot of ways. The characters and the story were all great up until the very end. At least with the story, the combat felt smooth and felt like an evolution of the original game's combat, while keeping in all of those things that we enjoyed from the original. This is going to be a very divisive game among some. Some people are absolutely going to hate it for the many different directions that Square Enix has taken. But all in all, I walked away feeling very satisfied. I'm looking forward to Part 2, and hope that they can take some of the criticisms of this game, especially the dungeons being padded out way longer than they need to, and make it feel more like a well-rounded experience. Square Enix has done a lot of things right in this game, and I really do hope that they take this as an opportunity to realize how they can evolve not just the Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2, but other entries in the Final Fantasy series as well. You guys have been watching Gaming with Spoons, you know the drill. Facebook, Twitter links going to be down below in that description box. Ring that bell notification if you want to stay up to date with all things JRPG, RPG, and Japanese gaming related. Want more reviews? Also a great reason to subscribe to the channel. Currently we are playing through Ys Memories of Celceta, which will be the next game on the channel that we are going to do a full review on. And most importantly, stay happy, be happy, game happy. Spoons is checking out.